Oh, hey there, Internet. So, I'm doing another stream, working on this page again. I ended up having to call it a night. One waiting. I guess that's probably me. So, as usual, welcome to my work in progress live stream here. Oops, I didn't want to do that. I'm doing digital ink washes on this Dream Life art, which is a sequel to Dream Life Book 1, and will appear in my upcoming book, Mind Engine Ignition Sequence, which I've rescheduled to launch next spring. But if you go to Patreon and pledge, you'll be able to see the work in progress and read it now, or at least read what's available now. You'll definitely be able to read the digital edition there of Dream Life Book 1. You can also go buy it outright instead of pledging on Patreon, either through my Gumroad site or from Amazon or Comixology. The Gumroad site link is in the doobly-doo, the description text below. Excuse me. You can also, on Comixology, grab Dracula, Son of the Dragon. That's the last graphic novel that I finished with Mark Sable. Let me just turn this down. It's a little distracting hearing myself delayed. There. And then as usual when I do these, you'll see right in the first paragraph of the doobly-doo, there's a link to a Discord, and I am also live streaming there. And if you want to chat with me, that's probably a quicker way to get my attention in theory, because you can voice chat. So I'll actually hear you. I've got the text chat open. In fact, let's pop this into its own window and put it on my secondary screen here where I can see it. But I don't always look up and see that, so I might be a little slow to respond if you ask me a question. Feel free, though. I got a super chat once, and I'm not sure if that creates an alarm. It keeps your question at the top until I click it or something. I appreciate those. That's cool. It's nice to get a few extra bucks, too. Definitely helps. And, of course, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so that you can catch my live streams and help me get the more eyes on my videos, so that then YouTube coughs up its pittances. It's really like they've increased the number of ads they put on videos once they're on the site. So like live stream I don't think has ads during them. I've never seen that, but they do once the final version of the video is rendered out and available. There's ads on those. And I noticed that they're putting many more ads in, which I mentioned because I noticed they don't pay us more for running more ads. It's not like we get any additional funds. Seems like less is more is the rule. I'm going to go to light holds. Go to light and let's... Why is that not working? I want holds. Try that again. Oh, it's because I was on the eraser mode. That's why. There we go. And so yeah. But with the increased subscription numbers, I've gone up to 10,000 now, which is great. And hopefully just trying to be more regular with posting stuff, doing more live streams and such. I do notice that my ad revenue is increasing, so we'll see. I'm not sure if I'm willing to make such a full-time thing of it. It might probably take to make YouTube really lucrative, because I want to draw comics being first and foremost. But every bit does help. I just did a short interview with True North. Is it True North Country Comics podcast? I think I got the title right, but I could be wrong. It's John on that. We did a very short interview, It's funny. He doesn't have. He has sort of like a fairly fixed set of questions he asks everybody, which I didn't. I'd listened to a couple of his interviews before doing it, but I didn't pick up on the fact that he was using sort of a bullet list of questions. So I've noticed that I tend to ramble on in interviews. So I'm making a point of, especially as I interview other people recently, of trying to be succinct, not going rambling on so much. But I think I also ended up making it a very short interview. It's probably going to be like 15 minutes or less once he's finished editing. That's fine. Not everyone wants to listen to long interviews. I got everything important out. So I don't know when that's going up, but I'll mention it somewhere on the channel here. And then I'm interviewing people too with Sam Noir for the Sequential podcast. Those are starting to get edited finally. It's taken me a while to make time and get those done, but I got 2 of them done. Sam and I need to do an intro episode and mutual interview each other for one, just to set up the series. And we just recorded our 7th with Hoche, and that went nicely. He's a real sweet guy. Like I didn't have misconceptions that he wasn't a sweet guy. We've met in passing over the years, really, that I can be sure of only once, which we talked about briefly. He remembered me. Got a good memory. Because it was a very short encounter too. But we came up, like he's just a little older than me, and he was definitely bolder than me. He started trying to get into the business real young, and I definitely was thinking about it, but I didn't have the balls to submit my stuff to publishers until I think it was 19 or something, maybe 20. Whereas he was doing it when he was 17. He was walking into Vortex Comics and sending his stuff to just about everybody to try to get work. So, I mean, that's not a lot earlier, but I think that takes a special kind of confidence, audacity. He joked how he was, too dumb to know better when he was at that age, which is always a little bit true when we're young and bold. But it's still also that's how art works. Like, probably no one would become a successful artist if they weren't a little bit crazy and a little bit egotistical and bold. I think actually, you know what? I want more, more like that. Because we're basically looking at the ground there, but I don't actually want to draw the ground. Why is that not making marks? Oh, somehow I know what I did. Okay, I touched got fixed. Too dark. Let's get rid of that and try again. There we go. Yeah. A little succulent in the window here. I'm not going to repeat everything I yammered on about last time I did this yesterday, but just bullet points. We're currently, this is the first page that I've done digital washes for in Clip Studio, and it's gone very smoothly. I started working on it last night. Only got a couple hours in before it was getting late. I'm going to try to do a longer session today. I don't know if I'll have this camera on for all of it, but I'm trying to recreate the aesthetics that were achieved in book 1 of Dream Life by doing ink wash and ink on Bristol. And I got the basic aesthetics of it to work fine in Photoshop, but really have wanted to move away from using Photoshop. I've got a very old version, and I'm not interested in paying monthly license fees. So I've been trying out different software. I paid for a copy of Affinity, both Paint and Affinity Photo and Affinity. Is it Draw? What's the name again? Affinity Photo and Affinity. I got all three. Designer. And then also their replacement for InDesign, Affinity Publisher, which I have not yet really worked on, but I will be this week. I'm going to open it up with some students and look it over. InDesign and Photoshop and all that have been great. I've been using Photoshop since '91, folks. It was definitely not the program you use now. I had to install it on 6 hard disks, if I recall correctly. Actually, it's called floppy disks, but I always stipulate that it's a hard disk because I'm old enough to remember when floppy disks were actually floppy, and about half the size, or twice the size, I should say. And then hard disks were about half the size, and not floppy at all. If you opened it up, there was a floppy disk inside, metallic. Same thing that you get in a tape, so some sort of acetate with probably an iron oxide on it to encode the ones and zeros. But so yeah, in Photoshop I was able to get an aesthetic that I was pretty happy with, but I didn't want to use the program anymore. I've tried out Affinity a little bit, and it's a promising program, but its UI is different enough, and I wasn't finding it totally intuitive for me. I don't want to discourage other people from checking it out, because I think it's very powerful, and it's just a question of like how much time I want to spend learning a new UI. And so I didn't write it off, but I also paid for Clip Studio a couple of years ago, and then just hadn't touched it. And so I figured, okay, it was time to do that. And the first time I'd open Clip Studio up, I'd opened in a different interface. I think it was in the animation interface, and it just felt like there were too many options. That's one of the things with like really powerful programs. Is sometimes if you don't know how to filter out the stuff you don't need to use, it gets a bit distracting. But this time, I looked up a couple of tutorials before getting back into it, and I realized that there was a way to solve that problem and focus things. And then I got in there and customized my working space like you see it now, and figured out how all the tools, well, not all the tools I needed to use worked. And I've been very pleased. I've done some inking already. You'll see there's other live stream videos and a time lapse or two of me doing that. And now I'm doing tones and washes. And like before any of that, I was using it to do some thumbnails. So sort of easing in, that's a good way to go about learning new drawing software. Start with the things that you're going to do rough anyway. So thumbnail roughs are always loose and rough. Doesn't matter if your control is great. And then the pencils are a little tighter, so that's like the next thing to do. And then the inks, and now the washes. And I've done a little playing around with something else to test out the painting color, and that's looking really good. It's very solid. Look forward to painting in this program. It works. It's got all the functionality of Photoshop. The UI is similar enough to Adobe's that, without being identical, that I find very little friction and shifting gears and finding tools that are approximately the same function. Like their mesh transform is a good equivalent to liquify, which when I'm doing roughs and want to change things without redrawing everything, I'm a big fan of having used liquify for years. And their mesh tool, once I figured out how to increase the number of control points, it's not exactly the same, but it's pretty close. It works. It's good enough for what I need it for. And then I can always go into my old versions of Photoshop if I really need to edit a hand-drawn one. But for most of the stuff that I've been doing, mesh transform, I think that's what it's called, tool. Solid. It's good stuff. And the brushes are working well, and my ability to throw in the texture here, these little dots and stuff, that's meant to, when I scan my ink washes from Bristol, you get this sort of similar particle effect that happens, and it adds a little noise and roughness to the work, so it doesn't look too digital and smooth. And that's a really good way to avoid an overly too perfect mechanical looking digital feel to the painting. I still want the particularly for this comic, because the book one was done with ink wash and paper, so I really do want to match them. I don't want you to read the whole book when book 1 and 2 are finished and I collect them, for there to be this jarring jump between digital and analog. And it helps that I did some digital stuff to the work after doing the ink and wash in book 1. So there are gradients and touch-ups and things. And this one will be all digital from thumbs to finishes, but I'm able to match the organic aspects enough that it's not really an issue. One of my long-standing kind of hesitancies about doing digital art has had a lot to do with the fact that a lot of the things I really like about working with ink and ink wash on paper are the little moments that happen by accident that, generally speaking, you kind of have to plan for and control when you're working in a program like this. But the tools have gotten good enough that while that's still true, I think that the equivalent of the happy accidents, the sloppiness and roughness and rawness, once you get the settings dialed in, can be fairly unconscious. You're not constantly having to think about it. And so I'm happy with where that's gotten to and willing to compromise. I'm still going to keep working on paper sometimes. It feels good. It's nice. I like working on it. Also, it lets me turn off all the computers for a bit and just do that. But I'm pretty pleased with where this is at, and it's always good to keep pushing your skills. I mentioned last night I'm applying to some animation studios locally, because after the last few months, while I've weathered the shutdowns okay, as a freelancer and part-time teacher, I have a feeling that there have been very few freelance gigs that have come in this summer. None, actually, to be specific. A couple of feelers. I should say that there have been a couple of inquiries, but they've all fallen through so far. I have a rep, and so even with a rep, though, that tells you how slow things are. So I definitely have a little less money in the bank this year at this time than I did last year at this time. And then my classes, since Studio has cut me down from 2 classes a semester to 1, which I'm talking to him about that and some other things this week, but I have a feeling that as nice as that's been as a steady gig for the last 7 years, it's very part-time, so it left me a lot of free time to do my own things. I'm a little concerned that possibly, I don't know if it's over or something, but I don't think I'm going to be able to rely on it if they're only giving me 1 class a semester. I can't lean on that as a baseline anymore. That's not enough money. So, getting more students privately might be an option, but that's a lot of time management in terms of having to keep track of them all. One of the nice things about working at a school is that their administration takes care of that stuff. I just have to show up and teach the class. But really, what I need is a better, more regular paycheck. And I've known for a while that I needed to think about trying to, for a period of time, make a bit more money. I've got some back taxes to pay off, and no serious debt. I've never had a credit card or anything like that, but I definitely owe the government a few bucks, and I'd also just like to have a few more bucks in the bank for a while. I've been getting by on skin of my teeth stuff, but it's getting a little tedious, and I am turning 50 this month, and I would just like a little more wiggle room And with the way the economy, I think, is going to go in the near future, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that it seems like a lot of studios are gearing up and staffing up for new productions. That's not slowing down. I haven't done animation in a long time, literally over a decade. So that's going to be a bit of a challenge. I'm not sure if I'll be able to land a gig, but I'm going to give it a try, get some design work, which is what I did back in the day for Nelvana and Cinegroup and a couple of other operations. And I grew up around animation studios too, so I know the business. I've done a little bit of cell animation. I've been trying to find my old stuff to scan and reanimate it. I did stuff when I moved to Montreal for an ad agency that they used on websites. Hello, hi there, Lista. And I still have those drawings somewhere, but the flash animations that they generated from them no longer play. And they're very tiny. They aren't really big, so I want to rescan them and reanimate them for a reel, along with some other stuff I did. But I'm not really a cell animator. It was never my main thing. What I did when I worked in animation was design work, character design, prop design, location design. And then I also was a background inker for Sam and Max, Freelance Police TV show for, what was it, the first half of the one season that they had, I worked on. And then I moved to Montreal, so I didn't renew my contract when it came up. So animation's not like a passion for me, but it's a really solid gig for an artist who needs a day job. You know, like any kind of creative work, it's tricky. Like, if anyone feels like they're doing creative work and it just feels soul destroying because it's not their personal work, I'm not putting that down. It can be a real issue if you're exploiting your skills to make a living, but doing things that you have absolutely no joy in doing. So I'm not challenging that. But by the same token, working in an animation studio is a damn sight more pleasant than flipping burgers or washing dishes, I have to say. And it pays better, as a rule. So, it probably depends on what we're talking about, but that's been my experience anyway. So, as an artist, when I've looked for some kind of regular income source, I prefer freelance illustrator when clients are knocking. But when things are slow, having a studio gig to go to each day works for me, because I'm usually sort of, to be honest, like a little indifferent about the shows. Like, it's nice to work on a show you really like. Freelance Police was cool. I worked on Waynehead, which was and Eek the Cat, which was silly and it's fun to draw. Some other stuff. But in the end, I can walk away and leave it at work. I'm not so attached to animation that I particularly care. And I know that, it's not my work. I'm going to be one of many faceless contributors to a production who, if they're lucky, directors might get billing at the opening, but on the whole, even directors don't get credited until the end of the film in animated features and TV shows. So it's definitely not a field where you can expect to have your creative ego rubbed, and it's definitely more about contributing to a product, being hands for someone else, than it is expressing your own voice. And as long as you understand that going in, it can be really a really nice way to make a living as day jobs go. And I enjoy, as much as I am a loner in my studio and happy to spend a lot of time alone, it is nice for a change sometimes getting to do studio work where you go into work each day and there's this sort of little mini community. I don't make the mistake of thinking these are now all my best friends, but it's definitely nice to have some human connection and hopefully a positive working environment. Of course, the opposite is exceptionally bad for those stuck with a shitty work environment, but hopefully you don't have that problem. I definitely stay out of office politics and stuff on the job, precisely for that reason. I noticed when I worked at Nelvana, it was my first time I worked in an animation studio, that there were, and this is true for the studios that I've worked at when I was in-house, that there were, broadly generalizing, two dominant personality types for the staff. There were folks who live and breathe animation. They usually have Disney stuff everywhere or whatever their studio of preference is. Disney's the most common. And you know, they're definitely more like you know, it's a difference between like an artisan mechanic and someone who just wants to work in a shop and get their hands dirty and doesn't really care about the details. So the hardcore animation lifers are often a lot less invested in their own ego for the project, which is good for them. And then there are the artists who like me are doing it for a day job, and for them it can be difficult if they're not able to compartmentalize and put that aside and just do as a day job. But for those that can, then it's a really great, like I was saying, really great kind of chill way to pay the bills. And then I found left me also, especially because of the kid shows I was doing, which were very simply drawn, left me a lot of energy at the end of the day to go home and then work some more late into the night on my own books, do my own comics and stuff. And then, you know, the hardcore Disney fans and such, they will stick around the studio and keep working on production to production to production, whereas the creatives who are really doing it more as a day job tend to come and go more freely. Back in the 90s when I was doing it, that was basically how studios handled the ebb and flow of production cycles. So there was a good 3.5 years there where I worked regularly at Nelvana, and came back each time, and that had a lot to do with just like wanting the stability for a while and paying off some old debts. But the coming and going had a lot to do with every time there was a gap between productions, they would lay off a lot of staff, with the understanding that if you wanted to, when things geared up again, you'd be top of the list to come back in. And it worked well back then too, because in Canada we had UI, so now they have EI, employment insurance, but it used to be unemployment insurance, UI, and unemployment insurance was a damn sight better. EI is a lot more like a what was it called? Right to work, like a right to work program, than it is an unemployment insurance program. You get less and for shorter periods of time. But back under UI, it was no big thing to sweat if you got laid off for 6 to 8 months, because UI would cover that. And you get a reasonably significant proportion of what you had been paid on your salary or contract, as the case was for animators. But no, it's too dark. I want to lighten you up. There we go. that let me work for a year and a bit and then take a short break for a couple months and take some time for my own stuff and maybe do some hanging out with friends and traveling a little. And then when the studio was ready to gear up again, I'd be back and on to the next thing. Worked out very nicely. I think with the new system with AI, that's probably not as effective for people, especially because the cost of living's gotten so much higher too. People rag on millennials and Generation Z for shit, but man, those kids definitely don't have as easy as we did when we were their age. I'm Gen X, and none of us have it as easy as the boomers did. Oh, no shit. You need to shut up. I'm really lucky that I have been in the same apartment for over 20 years, so my rent control and that long stay means that I'm paying much more reasonable rents compared to what anyone else is right now in my city. And boy, I do not look forward to the day when my landlord decides they want to change that up, because it's gonna, the sticker shock on having to get a new place in Montreal now, it's gonna be painful if I ever have to do that. I imagine eventually I will, but yeah, not today, hopefully. Just keep sticking it out, doing my thing. It definitely helps, like my ability to weather the COVID crisis and everything else without having a lot of jobs coming in is entirely down to the fact that my rent is so low. It's a nice privilege to have, but one I am not going to bank on and bet will exist indefinitely. So I've been looking around and thinking about what to do. I applied to Oasis Studios. I'm gonna look at a couple more and try them. Kind of been looking at gaming studios too and visual effects, but I don't know. Not really excited about what I see and hear about those industries. Animation has its own issues, but I feel like some of the labor culture issues around those other industries are a little bit problematic. We'll see. We will see what we'll see. Change of subject. I was, shocker, on social media on a group dedicated to Aphantasia, which is a thing that I have. And people were going on about it. And some folks who have, so it's a kind of neurodivergency. I don't think it's anything related to autism per se, but there's a lot of comorbidity with autism. And for my part, I am not autistic, but I am dyslexic. And I have aphasia for proper nouns at times. It's a transient aphasia, not all the time, but it's pretty profound when it's happening. And then I have anomia. Sorry, well that's the aphasia, sorry. Anomia is the kind of aphasia. And then I have aphantasia, that's what I was trying to say. And that's an absence of mental imagery or internal sensory, I would call them hallucinations, but like when you're remembering things, apparently the majority of the population actually experiences a sensory recall. I don't. I think it's like 2% of us don't, and that's aphantasia. And then there's also a spectrum. Some people have less than others. But aphantasia is the full absence. So, like, there's definitely a spectrum of sensory recall or mental imagery, and that sort of also includes things like hearing sounds or tasting taste or touch and things like that. When you think about things, having those experiences too. There's a spectrum there, but anywhere along that spectrum is considered to be something other than aphantasia generally by the researchers studying it. And then there's thought to be different kinds and degrees of aphantasia. Like some people have no mental imagery, but they might actually have, get earworms and hear a song in their head, or be able to taste things when they think about them. But I have the full suite, and I don't like the fact that aphantasia is essentially, I think it's Latin for absence of imagination, because that's not what it is. I can imagine things. That's not the problem. It's not even a problem. I just don't see things in my head. I have cognitive notions about ideas that are non-visual. There's a one metaphor gets used a lot. It's a computer without a monitor. Yeah, kinda. Definitely I've used the analogy that it's sort of like I think in code, but I don't have a UI interface like Windows or OS to make it user-friendly. Although, I've always lived this way, and so it's not unuser-friendly for me. I understand how to translate my thoughts into real things outside, and as you can see, I can draw. I do lean on reference when I need to, but newsflash, so do all artists when they're learning. And so, like if I'm drawing something I've drawn many times before, kind of like the way I write a word from memory, I can usually draw things from memory. But especially in comics, there's always something new. It's always something you haven't done before. Like this school bus. I've drawn one or two school buses, but never a short schoolie like that. So I used reference. I pulled up some pictures of them. There's one I liked especially that I used the basic layout for, and a couple of quirks from others. It's sort of a mashup. And you'll never find a photo that's exactly my schoolie. There's one that's kind of close, because it was the baseline for the design that I used. And there's traits from others, and the angle's a little different than all of them, because it's informing my drawing. It's not, I didn't copy the drawing, but I looked at it to figure out what I wanted to do. And the trick is that almost all artists are doing that. Even Kim Jong-ji, I use him in my classes a lot as an example. So people will talk about how amazing his mind is, and he can imagine things, and it is. But, for example, he worked in the DMV of the Korean military and worked on cars. And so a lot of the cars and weapons you see him drawing are things that he hasn't not just seen them and drawn before. He's field stripped a weapon. He's repaired a car. He knows them intimately. And so, of course, yeah, he's able to then take that and use it to inform his drawings. They're much more observed even when he hasn't got a live reference in front of him. But he had to do that study. It just happened to be in the course of doing his service as a citizen of South Korea. So this is what all artists have to do. They have to educate their eyes. So if you want to draw a thing, you have to learn what those things look like and study them and draw them many times. And even if you don't draw them, just looking at them and spending a lot of time with them will really help a lot when you go sit down to draw them. But if you just go with what you remember, you can probably, if you spend a lot of time with a thing, do a decent approximation, and that might be good enough. Depends on how realistic or cartoony you want to be. But if you want to be really realistic, really accurate, then you're going to need to pull reference and ground your observations in the facts of what the thing is, and draw what you really see, not what you think you saw, which is what ends up happening when you don't use reference. Drawing what you thought you saw can be interesting. I'm not knocking that. But if you see an artist who does very realistic representational art, I guarantee you they use reference at times in order to inform that. And they've studied the things they're drawing very intensely. They don't just do that out of the blue. Even there are some famous savants, and they seem to have magical skills, but art savants, there's a guy who goes up in a helicopter and sees a city and then sketches it. And it's impressive, but if you look closely at his city sketches, the details are very muddy and roughly rendered. It's not a photograph. It's amazing what he does do. I'm not putting it down, but reflects that lack of disciplined study, particularly his early work. And now that he's done it many times as a kind of a performance, he's getting sharper and better because practice, dude. He's getting practice. But his savant status, that was a combination of the patience and obsession of an autistic disposition, plus extremely fine-tuned observational skill that is built into or a result of his autism, that he sees things and really takes them in and pays attention to all the details at once. And it's overwhelming. That's why he also has classic autistic behavior traits, because he's dealing with this intense data flow in his brain. But it's also limited. So like when he was starting out and first doing this and getting a lot of press, his rendering and his lines were very raw because he was unpracticed. His general capture was really impressive, but his use of the tools and mark making was crude. And then as he's been doing it more and more, I've noticed every time I see newer stuff from him, it's getting finer and more finer because he's getting that practice in. And so that's important for anyone, just us normal folks, or in my case, I'm neurodivergent, but I don't think I had some special gift when it comes to art. I just had a lot of patience, and I guess if that's a talent, then there's my talent. I had a lot of patience. But on the whole, that's the thing it really takes, is the grit, the patience to do the thing. So why did I talk about this? I was going to talk about how I was on Facebook, an Aphantasia group, and people were discussing different things, and I was noticing a trend in subject matter and people's paranoia and shame about being publicly visible as someone with aphantasia, which they saw as a disability. And I think it can be a handy, so like people who are aphantagic like myself who were born that way, like this is all I've ever been. I have no memory of vivid pictures. I remember as a little kid kind of lying when people would ask about it, because I wasn't sure what was going on, and I thought it was sort of a game and playing along, and was a little unsure if there was something wrong with me, so I kind of covered for it. But in truth, I never really saw pictures in my head. And I didn't know if there was a name for it then, because there wasn't, or what it was, or if it was something I should be able to overcome. And I would try. I did meditation and various visualization exercises to see if I could change it. And it didn't. It persisted. So I just learned to live with it, and it didn't seem to be a big problem, because when I decided to learn how to draw, I'd been doing it informally for years, and then in my teens I decided to make it my career path. It didn't really seem to present a big problem. I was able to do it quite quickly, actually, because I'd been spending, so in my case, I'd grown up around, my mother was an artist. I got to hang around Nelvana Studios as a little kid. I'd seen a lot of artists making art, so a lot of the process and mechanical doing of it I observed, even though I hadn't done it before. And that meant that I came to the whole thing with a big leg up on anyone else who doesn't have a family in the arts and has to figure this stuff all out for the first time and has no idea. I already knew it was a low-hanging fruit. It was achievable. It wasn't some mystery. I'd seen others doing it. I just had to figure out how they did it. And that comes down to essentially mimicry. I'd watch people, when I was at my mother's work at Nelvana, I'd watch how people drew and how they used their tools, and I'd ask them questions. And then when I got into art school or was at home drawing for myself, I would apply the things that I was learning from that. And I think I'm going to take this in. I want a shadow there. And so when I went to Wexford CI, it was an arts enriched high school, and started doing we had 2 classes a day in the arts program. I actually, for the first couple of years, I improved way faster than anybody else because I had all of that past exposure and experience and understood some concepts that the teachers were teaching for the first time to most of the students. I was already there and ahead, and I was just focusing on applying it. So there was a brief beat there where the teachers sort of took that in and figured out who I was and what I was able to do, and then they kind of let me run and encouraged me, which was good, and get in the way of that, and gave me a lot of positive support and direction So I was able to make the best use of the time I was there. And in the end, I dropped out because I had a problem with the academic side of things. I was getting bored and frustrated with how it was being done, and started skipping a lot of classes. And they eventually the art department wanted to keep me around because they liked me, but the school administration thought I was a troublemaker, kicked me out. And so I just made a full-time independent study of it. I would spend all my time when I wasn't working part-time in restaurants, drawing, studying things and drawing things. And I definitely think that lead start I had from exposure, I don't think I lost it exactly, but it stopped being so significant once a lot of my peers were catching up in terms of what they knew. But I had a very, this is all getting around to the point of this, a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. So these are psychological concepts you can look up. And a growth mindset, they're not either ors. They're not. This is one of the things that came up with the Facebook clashes. People were reading it as like either or, because growth mindset versus fixed mindset sounds like an either or dichotomy. But when you actually dig into it and read beyond the headlines, and this is a key point, like always read more than just the headlines, folks. If you just read the headlines, you're talking out your ass if you make utter absolutist opinions, especially strong opinions about a thing that you really only superficially understand. So part of the problem is that a lot of people are dualistic about it. So if you approach either mindset as an absolute, then you're doing it wrong. The truth is that every human being goes through different periods in their life and probably has a growth mindset or a fixed mindset about different subjects in their life. And that's fine. It's normal. The trick is, the important point is to be aware of these things and mindful about which one you're bringing to the table in a given situation. And you should always try to eschew a fixed mindset in general. But you may decide your relationship to a given task or skill or ability essentially is that you're not willing to do the things that it would take to do it. And that's not a moral judgment on you. You might not have the time or the energy or the means to invest in acquiring that skill. That's life. And so a fixed mindset is one where it's more essentialist, which means that you think the way you are is how you're going to be. So you're bad at spelling. That's just who you are. You're bad at spelling. It's not going to change. You're bad at spelling. That could have easily been me because I'm dyslexic. So I'm bad at spelling. I'm still bad at spelling. But I did not have a fixed mindset. For a long time, while I didn't have a fixed mindset about it, I didn't feel like it was worth it to me to do the extra work I needed to do in order to even come close to approximating the skills that those who took it for granted and could just do it without thinking about it were able to not even really do. They could just unconsciously figure out and not have the problems that I have as a dyslexic person. So until I was about 25, I was effectively one half illiterate. So by that I mean that I was able to read. It was taxing, but it was slow. But I enjoyed reading science fiction and fantasy. So I would read a couple books a month, actually. Quite a bit, really, for someone who found it very difficult. And I would often read before going to bed because it would knock me out. So it's a great way to get to sleep. And also fun. And I didn't seep stories in my head, but I could still tell my stories and tell stories in my head or read stories in my head and conceive of them. I'm not visualizing them, but I could conceptualize things. Like I really loved, one of my favorite books when I was a teenager was I forget what the name of the trilogy is. Daniel Keyes Morgan, Emerald Eyes, Armageddon Blues, And there's another book in the trilogy, but I forget the name of it right now. And they were really cool. And there was all sorts of rich descriptions of the world. And I didn't see them, but his descriptions allowed me to conceptualize them. So that's a weird distinction to make, maybe. But the difference being that while I don't have a picture, his information that he put in the page, the information he put in the page, allowed me to imagine spaces the same way I can remember a space that I was in yesterday, which is to say I don't see it, but I have this kind of mental informational map, descriptions of things that were in it, and I do have this sort of like kinesthetic sense of a space. Like right now I'm sitting at my desk and I have a pretty good sense of how far the wall is from behind me, even though I can't see it, because I've been in this studio for years and I know its dimensions. And it's probably the same information that informs the mental imagery that people who visualize have. I just don't generate the mental imagery. For me, I suspect that it actually makes me think a little faster, which isn't always a boon. My brain would race when I was younger and didn't know how to slow it down and pace myself, because I would race through concepts and ideas, and then also ricochet around from adjacent ones that they reminded me of. I'm not ADHD, but I have some similar mental traits as people with ADHD and attention issues. So I've had to learn to focus and be selective about that mental energy and where it's going. I'm fortunate that I don't actually have a disorder, either hyper or inattentive, because I was able to, I think what I was able to accomplish in terms of my focusing is something that someone with those deficits might be able to accomplish, but it would take them more energy. And so there we go with the distinctions I'm making with growth versus fixed mindsets. Talking about that doesn't mean that, like, if you recognize that a growth mindset means that, in theory, if you're willing to do the work and put the energy in, there is very little you can't improve about your skills and abilities. It's not that you can do anything. It's not everyone's a secret genius and they just need the opportunity. That's not it. It is that no matter how much of a handicap you might have, including being blind, if you want it bad enough, if you really want to engage in, say, making visual art, even if you're blind, you can probably take the skills that you do have access to and find a hack, a workaround to accomplish something and improve on it and get, compared to where you started, better. It doesn't mean you're going to become Picasso or Da Vinci. It does mean that you'll be able to do a thing that you were previously unable to do and might have imagined was impossible if you had a fixed mindset. And so there are blind woodworkers. It's a thing. Look it up. They do it by touch. It's amazing. And there are blind painters. The ones that I've seen tend towards abstraction, but it's a thing. And there are blind photographers. It seems kind of crazy, but why? If they want to do it, whatever, that's fine. And their growth mindset has empowered them to accomplish enough with that set of skills that they've been recognized for their work. And some of them are actually quite good. So that's the main difference. It's not that, so the people on this group, when I'd shared this idea, a lot of them were attacking it for being toxic positivity, which is a thing, but the important point was, a lot of them were projecting wording and framing and phrasing onto things that I was not using. They were saying, don't tell people they should do this, and you can do anything if you just try hard enough, and that, judge them for not trying. Well, first of all, I was explicitly saying that the point is not to judge, but to not also judge and close the door on possibility, but decide where you want to put your energy, and know that once you've decided where you want to put your energy, not anything is possible, but anything is improvable. And you might be able to accomplish something if you're willing to accept the version of it that you're able to accomplish, simply by allowing for the fact that improvement is possible, learning is possible. It just takes some grit and patience. And means, like, if you have no time, that's going to be a real obstacle. You're not going to be able to invent time that you don't have. But if you have a really determined growth mindset and you really want something bad enough, there's probably also a way for you to find a workaround there too. It's not going to happen overnight, but you can probably find some solution to the time problem, some way to carve out more free time for yourself. There are low-hanging fruit by, like, changing your schedule around and, like, getting up a little earlier and carving out an hour or two every morning for just that thing you want to work on. Or every night, if the case may be, whatever works for your schedule. I'm more of a night person. For a lot of people, mornings are better. Let me look at this for a second. Oh yeah, that door. I want to do more of that door. Let's get a little bigger brush and do some broad, too dark, broad washes. Knock it back a little, put a little texture in there. Bit of shadow. The thing that was really frustrating is the people who were criticizing this were straw-manning me constantly. They were projecting arguments that I had not made and literally I was saying things that I had not at any one point typed. I even did word searches and showed them. You just told me I said a thing that's not anywhere in any text that I wrote. I didn't even imply it. I, in fact, explicitly addressed and said that's not what I'm talking about. But people will look at the headlines and then argue with their own past experience and fears, not with what's in front of them. They'll want to have the argument they want to have, not talk to the person in front of them and the proposition that's being made. And that's a terrible, terrible trait. It's sort of like, shorthand version of this that everyone's familiar with is people reacting to articles on Facebook without having actually read anything more than the headline, and speaking out of ignorance about what's going on. This also gets used as a way to dismiss people. But even that, when people tell someone that's all they're doing without actually checking to see if they've read the article, and if they've not just read the article, but fully understood it, read all the parts, and seen it and taken it on board, if you still have a problem with it and your coherent argument that cites your problem with it actually makes sense to someone else reading it because you're mentioning things that are actually present in the article that you're taking issue with and you've got a coherent argument for it, then great. But that's not what I was seeing. And it's a terrible habit that a lot of people fall into. So just this defensive knee-jerk rush to judgments and defensiveness, and they hear the voice of someone who judged them harshly. You could do this if you just wanted to, and instead of reading what's being said, you could possibly do this if you wanted to. Not just if you wanted to, but if you wanted to. If you really wanted this thing, and you could find the way to make time for it, you could definitely do something approximating it. Should you? Well, that's up to you. There's no should in that statement. Could you? Maybe, if you can make the time. And yeah, if you want it. Like I get people saying all the time, I wish I could draw. Well, you can. Can you write letters? I mean, unless you have no hands and are just unable to make a mark, I guess then that sucks. Sorry for that. Rough times. But otherwise, you could totally draw. But I don't often say this to their face unless the situation's appropriate for it. But what they're really saying is, if I didn't have to do anything about it and just magically, wish on a genie, and bang, I have drawing skills without doing the work, I wish that could happen. And like, shit, man, I agree. I wish I could magically make my drawing skills even better. And also $1 million in the bank. How about that? Well, I'm wishing. But, it's not how life works. But if you're willing to study and shit, I totally assure you, you could draw. Doesn't take magic talent. Doesn't take something that is like an intangible other thing that I possess and you don't. I had opportunity, and I had no obstacles, and I had a growth mindset towards the ability to draw, the skills that were required to draw. And so, with a lot of work and time, I was able to get halfway decent pretty quickly and then continue to improve throughout my life. I've got 30 years of it under my belt now, doing it with an intent to be professional. 20 of that actually being a professional, and 7 now teaching, which gets you to reframe and rethink about your skills a lot, so you can become even better, for sure. And that's great. Not everyone has that as an option available to them. And you might not feel like you're in enough control in your life to make it happen. It's fair enough. There is a difference between feeling like it and actually not being in control, unless you're in a prison. Often that's more perception. People will think that there's things they just can't do because of family pressure or social pressure or expected norms. But those things are all very permeable, abstract cultural notions. Artists often get applauded for being bold, and when they want to accomplish what they want to do, they'll go against them. But that's something that anyone can choose. There's always, of course, a cost when you push back against social norms, but it hasn't killed me yet. I'm still here. I'm still making art. I'm still learning. Well, that's an hour for a panel of drawing and yakking. So I think, let's look at this for a minute, see how it's going. Yeah, that works good enough. So I'm going to shut down the stream, keep it to exactly an hour and 3 minutes. Hope you enjoyed my rambles. You're welcome, Daft D. And not sure if I'll turn the stream back on later when I sit back down to work, but I might. We'll see. Take it easy, keep drawing, and have a growth mindset. It's not obligatory, but it's definitely helpful.